Since when do you date? The question left Adrian Cross's mouth before I even realized he was standing in front of me, and in a room filled with chandeliers, polished marble, and Manhattan's most powerful people. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single heartbeat. I remember the exact second it happened because everything slowed down like a movie stuck on pause. The violin quartet was still playing somewhere near the balcony. Champagne glasses still clinked softly across the ballroom. But Adrian wasn't looking at the music or the crowd or the million-dollar deals happening around him. He was looking at me, and then at the man standing beside me. I had worked for Adrian Cross for almost 4 years, long enough to know the difference between his polite smile and the expression he wore now. This wasn't the calm, untouchable mafia boss the city whispered about in private clubs and back rooms. This was something colder, something personal. "Mr. Cross," Ethan Coles said politely beside me, extending a hand like he had no idea he was stepping into a storm. Ethan was tall, confident, the kind of man people trusted instantly. Dark jacket, easy smile, the kind of voice that sounded comfortable in a crowded room. Exactly the kind of person who didn't belong within 20 feet of Adrian Cross when Adrian looked like that. Adrian didn't shake his hand. Not right away. His eyes stayed on me. Ice blue, sharp enough to make my pulse stumble. "Claire," he said slowly, as if the single syllable carried weight. "I asked you a question." Around us, the charity gala continued like nothing unusual was happening. Politicians laughed near the bar. A tech billionaire was describing a yacht he had just bought somewhere off the coast of Miami. But people were starting to notice the silence forming in our small corner of the room. Because when Adrian Cross stopped speaking, the air had a habit of paying attention. "Since when do you date?" he repeated. I should explain something. Adrian Cross wasn't just my boss. On paper, I was his executive assistant. I managed his calendar, filtered his calls, arranged meetings with senators, CEOs, and people whose names never appeared in newspapers. I knew which scotch he drank when negotiations went well and which one he reached for when they didn't. I knew he slept maybe 4 hours a night. I knew he hated hospitals and avoided them at all costs. But the one thing I had never seen before tonight was jealousy. And yet there it was, sharp and unmistakable, standing in front of me in a perfectly tailored black suit. "Since always," I said calmly, though my heart was beating faster than I liked. "You just never asked." Ethan glanced between us like someone watching two weather systems collide. "Claire and I met last week," he added lightly, clearly trying to ease the tension. "She mentioned she works for—" "I know where she works," Adrian said quietly. His voice didn't rise. It never did. But the softness made it more dangerous somehow. His gaze finally shifted to Ethan's hand, still extended. After a moment that felt much longer than it should have been, Adrian shook it once. Firm, brief, controlled. Then his attention returned to me, and the faintest crease appeared between his brows. Not anger. Something more complicated. Something unsettled. "Interesting," he murmured. I had seen Adrian negotiate billion-dollar contracts without blinking. I had seen rival businessmen leave meetings looking like they had just walked through a hurricane. But tonight, for the first time since I had known him, Adrian Cross looked off balance. And the strangest part was realizing why. Because the man who ruled half the city like a chessboard was staring at me the way someone looks at a move they never saw coming. I watched the moment Ethan realized something was wrong. It was subtle at first, just the way his smile hesitated for half a second too long, the way his shoulders stiffened as Adrian released his hand. Most people needed weeks to understand the atmosphere around Adrian Cross. Ethan figured it out in less than 10 seconds. That alone made me curious about him. Around us, the ballroom lights reflected off crystal glasses and polished marble floors, casting soft gold across the crowd. Someone nearby laughed loudly at a joke about venture capital. Waiters moved through the room carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne that probably cost more than my monthly rent. On the surface, nothing had changed. But I could feel Adrian's attention like gravity pulling the entire room slightly off its axis. He looked at me the way a man studies a locked door he has never noticed before. "You did not mention you had plans tonight," he said. The words were simple, but Adrian had a way of turning simple sentences into questions that felt heavier than they should. "You did not ask," I replied, keeping my voice calm even though my heartbeat had not settled yet. It was strange how easy it was to forget that Adrian and I worked together in a professional setting. For years of managing his schedule meant I knew almost every hour of his day. I knew which mornings he preferred black coffee instead of espresso. I knew which meetings ran exactly 20 minutes longer than planned because the other person in the room underestimated him. I knew how many miles he ran before sunrise on the rare mornings when he actually slept long enough to see it. But he knew almost nothing about my life outside his office. That had always been the rule. Claire mentioned this event earlier. Ethan said carefully, trying again to smooth the tension. I happened to have the evening free, so I offered to come along. Adrian's gaze shifted to him again. Not hostile, not welcoming either, simply measuring. That was generous, Adrian said. His voice remained calm, but there was a quiet edge beneath it that most people would miss. I did not miss it. Ethan nodded politely, clearly unsure whether he had just been thanked or warned. Adrian then turned his attention back to me, and for a brief second something crossed his expression that I had never seen before. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to confusion. It disappeared almost instantly, replaced by the composed calm that made half the city nervous when his name appeared on a meeting invitation. Enjoy the evening, he said. Both of you. The sentence sounded polite enough for anyone listening nearby, but the pause before the last two words made the message clear. Ethan glanced at me again, as if asking whether he had just walked into the middle of something he did not understand. The truth was, I was not sure I understood it either. Because Adrian Cross had built an empire by controlling every variable in the room. Every conversation. Every risk. Every outcome. Yet tonight he had looked at me like someone who had just discovered that one small piece of the board had been moving without his permission the entire time. And the most unsettling part was realizing that the man who controlled everything did not seem to know what move to make next. I tried to focus on the conversation Ethan had started about the charity foundation, something about scholarships and medical research, but the words kept slipping past me like water through my fingers because I could still feel Adrian somewhere behind us. Not looking directly, not speaking, just existing in the room the way a thundercloud exists above a quiet city. You do not always see it, but you feel the pressure change in the air. Ethan was saying something about Boston, about how he had moved to New York 2 years ago for work, when I noticed the shift in the room again. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the subtle way people began clearing a path without realizing they were doing it. Adrian Cross was walking toward us. I had watched that walk for 4 years. Confident, but never rushed. Measured steps that somehow made 6 feet feel like a much longer distance. He stopped beside us again, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of cedarwood from his cologne. His presence alone was enough to silence Ethan mid-sentence. Adrian glanced briefly at the man beside me before turning his attention to the glass of sparkling water in my hand. You switch to water, he said calmly. You usually choose champagne at these events. It took me a second to realize what he had done. Adrian had not just noticed me arrive with someone else. He had noticed what I was drinking. Ethan looked between us again, clearly puzzled by the detail. I gave a small shrug. It is a work night, I said. You still have 3 meetings scheduled tomorrow morning. Adrian replied automatically. 8:30, 10:15, and 11:45. Ethan blinked. You memorized her schedule? Adrian did not answer the question directly. His eyes stayed on me. It is part of my schedule, he said after a moment. I could not help the small laugh that escaped me. Adrian, I manage your calendar. Not the other way around. For the first time that evening something almost like amusement flickered across his expression, but it faded quickly when Ethan spoke again. Claire was telling me earlier that she hardly ever takes a night off, Ethan said. I thought it might be nice for her to enjoy the city for once. Adrian went very still. The pause that followed lasted only 2 seconds, but I knew him well enough to recognize the calculation happening behind those pale blue eyes. He turned slightly toward Ethan, studying him the same way someone studies a new variable in a carefully planned equation. The city can be unpredictable, Adrian said quietly, especially for people who are not used to how it works. Ethan held his gaze without flinching, which impressed me more than I expected. I grew up in Chicago, he replied. I am familiar with unpredictable cities. Adrian nodded once, acknowledging the answer without fully accepting it. Then he looked back at me again, and the intensity of his attention made the noise of the gala fade into a distant blur. Claire, he said slowly, I do not recall approving tonight as a personal evening. I raised an eyebrow. You do not approve my personal evenings. Another pause. This one felt heavier. Around us the violin quartet shifted into a slower melody, something soft and elegant that drifted across the ballroom. Adrian's expression changed slightly, not angry, not cold, just thoughtful in a way that made me uneasy. Perhaps that has been an oversight, he said quietly, almost to himself. Ethan glanced at me again, clearly aware that whatever existed between Adrian Cross and his executive assistant was not nearly as simple as it appeared on paper. And standing there between them, I realized something unsettling. Adrian Cross was not angry that I had brought someone to the gala. He was trying to understand why the idea of me being here with someone else bothered him at all. And judging by the look in his eyes, the answer was beginning to bother him more than the question ever had. I had the strange feeling that the room had become smaller. Not physically, of course. The ballroom was still enormous, stretching nearly 100 feet from the marble entrance to the glass terrace overlooking the river. But the space around the three of us felt compressed, as if the entire gala had quietly stepped back to give Adrian Cross the floor. Ethan cleared his throat gently, the sound polite but deliberate. Well, he said with an easy smile, I should probably grab us another drink. Claire, would you like sparkling water or something stronger? I opened my mouth to answer, but Adrian spoke first. Water, he said calmly. Ethan looked at me. I gave a small nod. Water is fine. Ethan smiled again, the same relaxed confidence he had carried all evening. All right, I will be right back. He stepped away toward the bar across the ballroom, leaving Adrian and me standing a few feet apart beneath the soft glow of a chandelier that probably weighed more than my car. For the first time that night, Adrian did not immediately speak. His eyes followed Ethan across the room, tracking the man with the quiet focus of someone who noticed everything. When Ethan finally disappeared into the crowd near the bar, Adrian's attention returned to me. You did not mention him, he said. His voice was low, steady, almost conversational. Because he is not relevant to your calendar, I replied. Adrian tilted his head slightly, studying me with that analytical calm I had seen him use on corporate negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You rarely attend events like this with company, he said. You usually stay near the logistics table and make sure the schedule runs on time. I folded my arms lightly, raising one eyebrow. You notice that? I notice everything that affects my operations. The answer came instantly, but something about the way he said it felt incomplete. I let out a quiet breath. Adrian, tonight is a charity gala, not a board meeting. His gaze sharpened slightly. For you perhaps. That was the problem with Adrian Cross. Even when he was not technically wrong, he had a way of making every situation feel like a negotiation. I glanced toward the bar where Ethan was still waiting in line for drinks. Then I looked back at Adrian. You are not interviewing him, I said. He is just someone I invited. Adrian's expression remained calm, but the faint line between his brows returned. You invited him. Yes. Another pause stretched between us, quiet but heavy with unspoken thoughts. The violin music shifted again, something slower now, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the air around us like distant waves. Adrian looked out across the room for a moment, his eyes briefly scanning the crowd the way he always did, instinctively noting every face, every movement. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly. Not colder, more careful. Claire, he said, how long have you known him? I considered the question. A week. That answer seemed to land somewhere deep in Adrian's mind, because his gaze returned to me with renewed focus. 1 week, he repeated quietly. That was enough time to bring him into a room where half the people here would sell their own companies to know who I trust. I felt my patience thinning. He is my guest, I said firmly. Not your employee. Adrian held my gaze. Seconds passed. The room around us continued to buzz with conversation, but I could feel the tension between us tightening like a wire pulled too far. Finally, he exhaled slowly, almost as if he had just reached a conclusion he did not entirely like. Perhaps, he said quietly, I have allowed certain boundaries to become unclear. I frowned slightly. What does that mean? Adrian studied me for a long moment, his expression thoughtful in a way that made my stomach twist with unease. Then he said something I had never heard from him before. It means, Adrian Cross said calmly, that I may have underestimated how important your personal choices have become to me. I stared at Adrian for a moment, trying to understand whether I had heard him correctly. In the 4 years I had worked beside him, I had seen him dismantle negotiations with a single sentence and close billion-dollar deals without raising his voice. Adrian Cross was not a man who admitted uncertainty, yet something in his tone just now sounded dangerously close to it. Important to you, I repeated quietly. That is a strange way to describe your assistant's social life. Adrian did not look offended. If anything, the faint crease between his brows deepened as if he was examining the statement from several angles at once. You are not simply an assistant, he said. That is a title, not an accurate description. I let out a small breath that felt halfway between a laugh and disbelief. Adrian, my job description is literally written in your company handbook. The handbook was written 3 years ago, he replied calmly. Circumstances evolve. I shook my head slightly. You mean your business evolves? His eyes stayed on mine, steady and analytical. My business depends on people I trust. There it was again, that word. Trust. Adrian rarely used it because he rarely gave it. The city knew him as a man who built alliances carefully and broke them just as carefully when necessary. Hearing him place that word anywhere near me made the conversation feel heavier than it should have been. Before I could respond, Ethan returned from the bar carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. Sorry about the wait, he said cheerfully, handing one to me. The bartender is overwhelmed tonight. Adrian stepped back half a pace as Ethan joined us again, the movement subtle but deliberate. His expression returned to its usual calm mask, the one most people in the room recognized. If someone had walked up at that exact moment, they would have assumed the 3 of us were simply discussing the charity event like polite adults. Only I knew how much tension had already passed through the air between us. Ethan glanced at Adrian. Mr. Cross, I was just telling Claire earlier that the view from the terrace looks incredible tonight. Have you seen it? Adrian followed his gaze briefly toward the glass doors that opened onto the balcony overlooking the river. The skyline beyond shimmered with thousands of lights reflecting across the dark water. It was the kind of view real estate developers used in advertisements for apartments that cost several $1,000,000. I have seen it, Adrian said. Ethan smiled lightly. Claire and I were thinking of stepping outside for a few minutes. Fresh air, and all that. For a second, I wondered whether Ethan understood the quiet risk of saying that sentence directly in front of Adrian Cross. Adrian's eyes moved slowly from Ethan back to me. His expression did not change, but something in the silence that followed made my heartbeat pick up again. Of course, Adrian said finally. His voice remained calm, almost polite. The terrace is open to all guests. Ethan nodded, clearly relieved that the answer sounded reasonable. Great. Claire. I hesitated only for a moment before nodding. Sure. We began walking toward the glass doors together, Ethan a step ahead of me as he navigated through the crowd. I had just reached the edge of the ballroom when I felt Adrian's voice behind me again, quiet but unmistakable. Claire. I turned back. Adrian was standing exactly where we had left him, hands loosely at his sides, the chandelier light reflecting faintly in his pale blue eyes. The entire room seemed to continue moving around him while he stood completely still. Enjoy the evening, he said again. The words sounded identical to what he had said earlier. Polite, controlled, harmless to anyone listening nearby. But this time I understood the difference. Because Adrian Cross was not watching Ethan. He was watching me. And for the first time since I had known him, the look in his eyes carried something I had never seen before. Not authority, not calculation, something far more dangerous. The quiet realization that he did not like the idea of letting me walk away. I stepped out onto the terrace beside Ethan, and the first thing I noticed was the air. Cool, clean, a sharp contrast to the warm hum of conversation inside the ballroom. Manhattan stretched out before us in every direction, towers of glass and steel rising against the night sky, while the river below reflected 1,000 scattered lights like pieces of broken glass floating across the water. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the balcony railing and let out a quiet breath. Okay, he said with a small laugh. I have to ask, is every conversation with your boss that intense? I looked out at the skyline instead of answering right away. From this distance, the city looked peaceful, almost quiet, even though I knew millions of people were still moving through the streets below. You get used to it, I said finally. Ethan glanced at me sideways. I'm not sure anyone gets used to that, man. I almost smiled at that. Adrian Cross had that effect on people. Some admired him. Some feared him. Most did both at the same time. He runs a complicated organization, I said. Complicated people tend to notice details. Ethan leaned his elbows on the railing, studying me with curiosity that felt genuine rather than intrusive. He notices a lot about you. The words hung in the air for a moment. I traced the rim of my glass with my fingers, watching the condensation collect along the clear surface. We work closely, I replied. Ethan did not push immediately, which I appreciated. Instead, he looked out across the river again, letting the quiet stretch between us naturally. After a moment, he spoke again, softer this time. You know, when he walked up earlier, I thought he was about to fire me. That made me laugh under my breath. You should consider yourself lucky. Adrian usually does not bother walking up personally if he dislikes someone. Ethan turned toward me with raised eyebrows. That is supposed to make me feel better? It means he was curious, I said. Ethan studied my expression carefully, as if trying to decide whether I believed that explanation myself. Curious, he repeated slowly. That is one word for it. I leaned against the railing beside him, the cool metal pressing lightly against my forearms as the city wind lifted a few strands of my hair. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The distant sound of music from inside the ballroom drifted through the open doors behind us. Then Ethan said something that caught me off guard. You have known him a long time, have not you? I nodded. For years. Ethan let out a low whistle. That explains it. Explains what? The way he looks at you. I felt my shoulders tense slightly. How does he look at me? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back toward the glass doors that led into the ballroom. Through the reflection on the glass, I could see people moving inside, elegant shapes passing beneath golden lights. But one figure stood still near the center of the room. Adrian Cross. Even from this distance, I could recognize the quiet stillness of his posture. Ethan followed my gaze. Like a man who just realized something important, he said quietly. I looked back at Adrian through the glass, and for a second our eyes met across the distance between the ballroom and the terrace. The moment lasted only a heartbeat before someone stepped between us inside the room. But the expression I saw in Adrian's eyes stayed with me. Not anger. Not authority. Something far more unsettling. The look of a man who had finally noticed the one thing in the room he had never planned to lose. I kept looking at the glass doors for a moment longer, even after the reflection shifted and Adrian disappeared into the moving crowd inside the ballroom. Something about the way Ethan had described that look unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Adrian noticing something was not unusual. Adrian realizing something important was different. You look like someone just moved a piece on the chessboard, Ethan said lightly beside me. I let out a quiet breath and turned away from the glass. That is a very accurate description of how he sees the world, I said. Ethan smiled a little at that and took a sip from his glass. The cool night air carried the distant sound of traffic from the streets far below, muted by the height of the building and the steady breeze coming off the river. For a moment, the terrace felt like a quiet island floating above the city. So how did it start? Ethan asked. You working for him? I leaned back against the railing again, thinking about the question. It started with an interview that lasted 11 minutes, I said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. 11 minutes? Adrian does not waste time, I replied. He asked 5 questions. I answered them. Then he hired me. Ethan laughed softly. That sounds about right. I looked down at the lights reflecting across the water. The strange part is that he never interviewed anyone else. Ethan studied me with interest. You know that for a fact? I nodded. I saw the hiring file later. There were no other applicants listed after my name. Ethan leaned his shoulder lightly against the railing beside me. So he saw something he liked. I hesitated. He saw something useful, I corrected. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Those are not always different things. Before I could respond, the terrace door behind us opened, and a pair of guests stepped outside, laughing as they crossed the balcony toward the far corner. The quiet moment we had been sharing shifted slightly as the space filled with more voices and footsteps. Ethan glanced toward the door, then back at me. Can I tell you something honestly? He asked. Of course. Your boss does not look at you like someone evaluating an employee. I felt that tension again, subtle but unmistakable. Ethan, I said gently, you have met him for exactly 5 minutes. That is all it took, he replied calmly. Some things are obvious. I looked back through the glass doors again without meaning to. Adrian was visible, now near the center of the ballroom, speaking with two men in dark suits. His posture was relaxed, his expression composed, the same controlled presence that dominated every room he entered. Anyone watching him would assume he was focused entirely on the conversation in front of him. But as I watched, his eyes shifted briefly toward the terrace again. Just for a second. Then he returned his attention to the discussion as if nothing had happened. Ethan followed my gaze once more. "See," he murmured. I exhaled slowly. "You are reading too much into this." Ethan smiled in a way that suggested he did not agree. "Maybe," he said. Then he glanced at his watch and straightened slightly. "Either way, I should probably not keep you out here all night. You said you still have an early meeting tomorrow morning." That made me laugh quietly. "Apparently my boss has already reminded you of that." Ethan chuckled. "He has a strong presence." We started walking back toward the glass doors together, but before I reached for the handle I hesitated for a moment and looked back at the city skyline again. The wind moved softly across the terrace, and somewhere below a boat horn echoed across the river. And for reasons I could not fully explain, I had the distinct feeling that tonight had quietly changed something important. Not in the city. Not in Adrian's empire. Something far more personal than that. Because somewhere behind those calm blue eyes, Adrian Cross had just begun asking himself a question he had never considered before. And knowing Adrian, once he started looking for an answer, he would not stop until he found it. I pushed the glass door open and the warm sound of the ballroom wrapped around us again like a wave. Music, laughter, the soft clink of crystal against crystal. For most people, the charity gala was still exactly what it had been all night. Elegant, expensive, and slightly performative. But as Ethan and I stepped back inside, I felt the subtle shift in the air again. Not visible, not loud, just the quiet awareness that Adrian Cross was somewhere in the room. And somehow that meant the room belonged to him. Ethan walked beside me with easy confidence, the same relaxed posture he had carried all evening. "Well," he said softly, "that terrace view definitely lived up to the expectations." I smiled faintly. New York has a way of doing that. We moved through the crowd toward the center of the ballroom where the main conversations were happening. Several guests recognized me and offered polite greetings, most of them people I had arranged meetings for or coordinated events with over the years. Being Adrian's assistant meant I knew almost everyone in the room, even if most of them only remembered me as the person who made their appointments happen on time. Ethan leaned slightly closer so his voice would carry over the music. "Does everyone here know who you are?" he asked. "Most of them know my email address," I replied lightly. He laughed quietly at that. But before he could say anything else, a familiar voice interrupted from my left. "Claire." I turned and saw Adrian standing only a few feet away. I had not noticed him approach, which meant he had crossed half the ballroom without drawing attention to himself. That alone said something about the way he moved through a room. His expression was composed, the same calm authority he carried in every business meeting. But the moment his eyes settled on me, I felt that same quiet intensity from earlier return. "Adrian," I said. Ethan turned slightly, polite as ever. "Mr. Cross." Adrian gave a brief nod of acknowledgement. His attention moved between us once, careful and measured, before returning to me. "I wanted to confirm tomorrow morning's schedule," he said. For a moment, I blinked in mild surprise. "Now." Adrian's expression remained neutral. The meeting with the Westbridge investors moved forward by 30 minutes. That was technically possible, but Adrian Cross had never once needed to confirm a calendar change in the middle of a charity gala. I knew that. He knew that I knew it. Ethan glanced between us again, clearly sensing that the conversation carried more meaning than the words themselves. I straightened slightly and answered in the same professional tone I used every workday. "In that case, I will adjust the briefing notes before 8 o'clock. Adrian nodded once. The exchange should have ended there. But instead he remained standing exactly where he was, his gaze resting on me for 1 second longer than necessary before shifting briefly toward Ethan. "Mr. Cole," Adrian said calmly. "How are you finding the event?" Ethan smiled politely. "Very impressive." Adrian studied him for a moment, the same analytical calm he used when evaluating a new business partner. "New York events can be educational," he said. Ethan's smile widened slightly. "I am beginning to see that." For a brief moment the three of us stood in a quiet triangle while the music continued around us. Then Adrian looked at me again, and the expression in his eyes carried a new kind of certainty. The same certainty he showed whenever he made a decision that would change the direction of an entire company. "Claire," he said quietly, "when you have a moment, I would like to speak with you privately." My pulse skipped once before I could stop it, because after 4 years working beside Adrian Cross, I knew something most people in the room did not. Adrian never asked for private conversations unless he had already decided exactly how they were going to end. I did not answer immediately. For a second, I simply looked at Adrian, trying to read the intention behind his calm expression the way I had learned to do over the past 4 years. Most people in the room would have heard a polite request from a powerful man speaking to his assistant. I heard something very different. Adrian Cross did not request private conversations unless he had already made a decision. Ethan noticed the pause beside me. He looked between the two of us with quiet curiosity before offering an easy smile that somehow eased the tension without pretending it was not there. "Of course," he said. "I can survive 5 minutes without Claire." Adrian inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the comment with the same composed politeness he used with every important guest. But his attention never fully left me. "It should not take long," he said. The tone sounded professional enough, yet there was a quiet certainty beneath it that made my pulse shift again. I turned to Ethan. "I will be right back." Ethan gave a small nod. "Take your time. I will find something interesting at the dessert table." His light tone earned a faint smile from me before I turned back toward Adrian. Without another word, he began walking toward the far end of the ballroom, where a quieter hallway led to the private conference suites used during events like this. I followed him through the crowd, aware of the way people subtly stepped aside when they noticed him passing. Adrian did not hurry. He never hurried. His pace was steady and deliberate, each step carrying the quiet authority of someone used to having space open in front of him. When we reached the hallway, the music softened behind us, replaced by the quieter echo of distant conversation and the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. Adrian stopped near one of the tall windows overlooking the city and turned to face me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The skyline outside glowed against the dark sky, thousands of lights scattered across the towers like constellations brought down to earth. Adrian rested one hand loosely in the pocket of his suit jacket, studying me with that familiar analytical calm. "How long were you planning to keep him around?" he asked finally. The directness of the question almost made me laugh. That sounds less like a scheduling inquiry and more like an interrogation. Adrian's expression did not change. "Answer the question." I crossed my arms lightly, leaning one shoulder against the window frame. "I have known him for a week." Adrian nodded once, the same quiet acknowledgement he gave when processing new information in a negotiation. "And tonight you decided to bring him here?" "Yes." "To an event where you know half the attendees have business connections with me?" "Also yes." Another pause settled between us. Adrian looked out at the skyline for a moment before returning his attention to me again. "You understand why that raises questions." I studied his face carefully. "Questions about my judgment," I said, "or questions about my personal life?" Adrian did not answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the faint music drifting through the hallway from the ballroom behind us. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, thoughtful in a way that carried more weight than any sharp accusation. "Both." I exhaled slowly. "Adrian, he is not a threat to your business. That is not the concern." The answer came instantly. I frowned slightly. "Then what is?" Adrian held my gaze for several seconds. In all the years I had worked beside him, I had seen him evaluate investors, politicians, competitors, and partners. But the look in his eyes now felt different from all of those. Less strategic, more personal. "The concern," Adrian said calmly, "is that I am realizing how little I know about the life you have outside my office." I blinked in surprise. "You have never asked." Adrian nodded once. "That was intentional." I tilted my head slightly. "And now?" Adrian Cross studied me for one long, quiet moment before answering. "Now," he said slowly, "I am beginning to think that may have been a mistake." I watched Adrian carefully after he said that. In the 4 years I had worked beside him, I had heard him admit many things. Strategic risks, market predictions, occasionally even mistakes in business calculations. But hearing him say he might have made a mistake about something involving me felt strangely personal in a way I was not prepared for. "You are saying my social life has suddenly become part of your strategic review process," I said lightly, trying to ease the weight of the moment. Adrian did not smile. His eyes remained steady on mine, thoughtful in that quiet, precise way that meant he was measuring every word. I am saying, he replied calmly, that after 4 years of working 12 hours a day with someone, I expected to understand her priorities better than I apparently do. I let out a small breath and looked past him through the window again. The river below reflected the city lights like a shifting mirror. Somewhere far beneath us a boat horn echoed across the water. My priorities have not changed, I said. Work has always been first. Adrian studied my expression as if testing whether I truly believed that statement myself. Then tonight is unusual. I turned back to him. People are allowed to have evenings off. Of course, he said immediately. The quick agreement almost made me smile. Adrian rarely contradicted something if it was logically true. Instead, he adjusted the angle of the discussion until the real issue surfaced. But bringing someone into your professional environment suggests a level of trust, he continued. Which is interesting considering you have known him for 7 days. I raised an eyebrow. You are doing background analysis on my date now? Adrian's expression remained calm. I perform background analysis on anyone who might interact with my organization. I crossed my arms. He is not interacting with your organization. He is interacting with me. The words hung between us for a second. Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly at the distinction. Claire, he said quietly, the difference is not always that simple. I felt a small spark of irritation rise in my chest. You are overthinking this. Adrian tilted his head just slightly. Overthinking is how I built everything you see outside that window. I almost laughed at that because it was impossible to argue with. Adrian Cross did not guess. He analyzed. That was how his empire functioned. But tonight the conversation felt less like a business evaluation and more like something neither of us had clearly defined. I leaned back against the window frame again. So what exactly are you trying to determine? Adrian was silent for a moment. His eyes moved briefly toward the ballroom entrance down the hallway, as if he could see through the walls and track exactly where Ethan might be standing inside the crowd. Then his attention returned to me again. I am trying to determine, he said slowly, whether I should be concerned. The answer caught me off guard. Concerned about what? Adrian held my gaze with that same calm certainty he carried into every major decision. About the possibility that someone else is beginning to occupy space in your life that I did not realize I valued. The sentence settled in the quiet hallway like a stone dropped into still water. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I felt my heartbeat shift slightly as the meaning behind his words became impossible to ignore. Adrian Cross was not talking about company security. He was not talking about strategic risk. He was talking about something far more personal than either of us had ever addressed before. I let out a quiet breath. Adrian, I said carefully, you are my employer. His expression did not change. Yes. And I am your assistant. Another brief pause. That is one way to describe our working arrangement. I frowned slightly. It is the only way. Adrian studied me for a long moment, the silence stretching long enough that I could hear the distant music drifting through the hallway again. Then he said something that made my pulse skip. It may not be the only way for much longer. I stared at him for several seconds after he said that, waiting for the faint hint of irony or strategy that usually hid behind Adrian Cross's most unusual statements. But there was none. His expression remained calm, thoughtful, almost frustratingly sincere. That alone made the moment feel far more dangerous than any raised voice could have. You are speaking in riddles tonight, I said quietly. Adrian did not react to the comment the way most people would. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, his shoulder resting against the window frame opposite mine, mirroring my position without appearing to notice he had done it. No, he said. I am speaking carefully. The quiet honesty in his voice made my pulse shift again. I folded my arms, trying to restore the familiar balance that had defined our professional relationship for years. Then explain it carefully, I said, because right now it sounds like you are suggesting something that does not fit reality. Adrian watched me for a moment before answering. Reality changes, he said simply. I let out a small breath of disbelief. Not this one. For a second the corner of his mouth almost moved, as if the certainty in my voice amused him slightly. But the expression faded before it could become a smile. Claire, he said quietly, you manage my schedule, coordinate my negotiations, and anticipate problems before anyone else in the company even recognizes them. You have been doing that for 4 years. I nodded slowly. Yes, that is my job. Adrian tilted his head slightly, studying me with the same focused attention he used when reviewing complex business proposals. You also remind me to eat when meetings run too long. I blinked once. That is still part of the job. You know which clients to trust and which ones to delay without me needing to explain why. Experience helps. Adrian's voice softened slightly. You notice when I have not slept enough and quietly move the less important meetings to the afternoon. I shifted my weight against the window. Efficiency improves productivity. Adrian exhaled slowly through his nose as if considering the list himself. And you have never once asked for anything in return. The words hung between us longer than the others had. I frowned slightly. That is because it is called employment. Adrian's gaze held mine steadily. No, he said. Employment usually involves boundaries. The quiet certainty in his voice made the hallway feel suddenly smaller. Adrian, I said carefully, you are overanalyzing a very normal working relationship. Am I? He asked calmly. I hesitated, because that question carried weight coming from a man who had built his entire life on reading situations correctly. Adrian turned his head slightly, glancing toward the ballroom entrance where distant music still drifted through the corridor. Then he looked back at me again. For years, he repeated thoughtfully, and tonight is the first time I have seen you arrive somewhere with someone else. I crossed my arms more tightly. You are not entitled to notice who I arrive with. Adrian nodded slowly. Correct. His agreement came too easily. That was what unsettled me, because Adrian rarely agreed unless he was about to redirect the conversation somewhere more precise. But, he continued quietly, I am entitled to recognize when something I assumed was permanent might not be. My brow furrowed. What exactly did you assume was permanent? Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied my face with a calm intensity that made my heartbeat slow and sharpen at the same time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty I had only heard when he finalized decisions that changed entire industries. You, Adrian Cross said simply. I assumed you would always be there. I did not answer right away. The quiet certainty in Adrian's voice lingered in the hallway between us, heavier than any raised argument could have been. I had spent 4 years working beside this man, learning the rhythm of his decisions, the precision behind his words. Adrian Cross did not say things casually. If he spoke a sentence, it meant he had already examined it from every angle. And that was exactly why his words unsettled me. You assumed, I said slowly, that I would always be there. Adrian did not hesitate. Yes. I let out a quiet breath and looked past him toward the tall window again. The city outside was still glowing, the river still carrying reflections of skyscraper lights across its dark surface. Nothing about the skyline had changed. But suddenly the space between Adrian and me felt very different from the countless late nights we had spent reviewing contracts or planning meetings in his office. That is a dangerous assumption, I said quietly. Adrian tilted his head slightly. Why? I turned back toward him. Because people are not fixed assets in a company ledger. Adrian's eyes remained steady on mine. I am aware of that. Then you should not be surprised that I have a life outside the office. Adrian nodded once, acknowledging the logic. I am not surprised that you have a life, he said calmly. I am surprised that I know so little about it. I crossed my arms lightly. That was the boundary we agreed on. Adrian studied my expression for a moment before responding. No, he said quietly. That was the boundary I assumed you preferred. I blinked slightly at that. You never asked, I said. You never offered, he replied. The answer landed with unexpected accuracy. For a second, neither of us spoke. The distant music from the ballroom shifted into a slower melody, something soft that echoed faintly through the hallway like a reminder that the world outside this conversation was still moving normally. Adrian exhaled slowly, then stepped a little closer to the window, standing beside me rather than across from me now. The movement was small, but it changed the feeling of the space immediately. Claire, he said after a moment, do you enjoy working for me? The question was so straightforward it almost made me laugh. You are asking that after 4 years? Adrian did not smile. Answer it anyway. I considered the question honestly. Yes, I said. You challenge people to think faster than they believed they could. You reward competence. And you do not tolerate unnecessary chaos. Adrian listened without interrupting. Most people in this city would consider that a compliment, he said quietly. It is meant as one. Another pause settled between us. Then Adrian asked the next question in the same calm voice. Then why bring someone like Ethan Cole into your evening tonight? I looked at him carefully. You already asked that. And you answered that he is not a threat to my business. Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly. But that was not the real question. I leaned back against the window frame again. What is the real question? Adrian watched me for several seconds before answering. His voice was lower now, more thoughtful than before. Whether he is a threat to something else. My brow furrowed slightly. Such as, Adrian Cross held my gaze with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally reached the conclusion he had been circling all night. Such as the possibility, he said slowly, that I may not want to remain only your employer. I felt the words settle in the space between us like a quiet shift in gravity. For a moment I did not move. Adrian Cross had negotiated with presidents of companies, dismantled billion-dollar deals, and built an empire that most people in the city only whispered about behind closed doors. But in 4 years I had never heard him speak a sentence like that. Not once. I let out a slow breath and studied his expression carefully. The calm composure was still there, the same control he carried into every boardroom and negotiation. But underneath it there was something new, something unguarded. Adrian, I said quietly, you realize how complicated that sentence is. His gaze remained steady. I am aware. I almost laughed at the understatement. No, I said, shaking my head slightly. I do not think you are. Adrian did not argue. Instead, he looked out across the skyline again for a moment, as if the lights of the city helped him organize his thoughts the same way charts and reports usually did. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, but unmistakably certain. Claire, I have spent most of my life calculating risks, he said. Business risks, financial risks, strategic risks. I do not speak unless I have considered the consequences. I crossed my arms slowly. And the consequences of what you just said? Adrian turned his head and met my eyes again. They are significant. That honesty made my chest tighten in a way I was not prepared for. You are my employer, I repeated quietly. Adrian nodded once. Yes. You built an entire company structure that depends on clear authority and professional distance. Correct. I tilted my head slightly. Then you understand why this conversation sounds like the beginning of a disaster. Adrian's expression softened by the smallest degree, the closest thing to a smile he had shown all night. Most people would call it a complication, he said. You call it a disaster. Because I am the one who manages the logistics, I replied. Adrian let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The music from the ballroom drifted faintly down the hallway again, and somewhere behind us a door opened as guests moved through the corridor toward the terrace. The world outside this conversation was still moving normally. But the moment between us had changed in a way that could not be undone. Finally, I looked back at him. Adrian, you are reacting to one evening, I said carefully. You saw me arrive with someone else, and suddenly you are re-evaluating 4 years of professional boundaries. Adrian shook his head slowly. No, he said. Tonight did not create the problem. My brow furrowed slightly. Then what did? Adrian studied my face with that same calm intensity he used when reaching the final step of a long analysis. Tonight simply forced me to notice something I should have recognized a long time ago. I waited. Adrian Cross rarely paused before finishing a thought. When he did, it meant the conclusion mattered. After a moment, he continued. I built my life around control, he said quietly. Control over outcomes, negotiations, variables. His eyes held mine steadily. But the moment I saw you walk into that ballroom with someone else, I realized something very inconvenient. I felt my heartbeat shift slightly. What? Adrian did not hesitate this time. That I was not prepared to watch you belong to anyone else. The sentence landed softly, but carried more weight than any declaration he had ever made in a boardroom. I held his gaze for several seconds before answering, because there was only one honest response to a statement like that. Adrian, I said quietly. You do not get to decide who I belong to. Adrian nodded once, accepting the truth of it without argument. You are correct, he said. His voice remained calm, but the certainty behind it had not changed. But I do get to decide whether I intend to compete for the chance.